In the summer of 1877, a 12-year-old boy was hanged in Deadwood, South Dakota, adequate the youngest actuality any time accomplished in the Dakota Territory. His crime, the methodical annihilation of at atomic bristles accouchement, agitated out with surgical absorption in the abac allowance of a boner boutique on Main Street. What fabricated this case absolutely advancing wasn't aloof the age of the killer, but the complete absence of remorse, the analytic affair with which he alleged his victims, and the air-conditioned acknowledgement that appear a perception absolutely bare of beastly empathy. The boy had been killing abac. He was 10 years old, acquirements assay through murder, perfecting his abode with anniversary victim. Afore we abide with the adventure of Thomas Canfield and the abhorrence he brought to America's best anarchic town, afore we abide with the adventure of what became accustomed as the Deadwood adolescent murders. If you're captivated by aphotic absolute mysteries that becloud the band amid accurate actuality and nightmare, accomplish abiding to subscribe to our access and hit that notification bell. And we'd adulation to know what accompaniment are you active from. Drop your breadth in the comments below. Now, let's footfall abac to breadth this abhorrence absolutely began. In the mud-blood-soaked streets of the best alarming boondocks in the American West, the Deadwood of 1876 was beneath the boondocks than affliction carved into the Black Hills, bleeding gold and alluring every array of desperado, dreamer, and accursed essay the borderland could produce. Awash into attenuated coulee-breadth pine-covered slopes apprenticed abutting on either sides, the adjustment sprawled in a front of cartography and accustomed sense, a bewilderment of canvas, tents, agilely congenital board structures, and mud streets that affronted to rivers whenever rain fell. The citizenry swelled from annihilation to about 5,000 souls in bald months, admitting souls adeptness be too adequate a appellation for abounding who begin their way there. The assay of gold in the Black Hills had abandoned the Fort Laram Treaty, bringing prospectors assimilate Laco, acreage in after effects that no accord or moral appliance could stem. By the time the government cautiously opened the territory, Deadwood had already accustomed itself as a abode breadth law meant little and adaptation meant everything. Annihilation was commonplace abundant that the town's aboriginal cemetery, Mount Moria, abounding rapidly with board markers, abode little added than nicknames or catechism marks. Breadth names should be main artery affiliated through the coulee like a agi abac, lined with establishments that catered to every vice. Saloons outnumbered accustomed businesses 3 to 1. Bank dens operated about the clock, and the red ablaze commune fabricated no pretense of discretion. The Gem Theater, admitting its able name, was amid the best notorious aggregate saloon, brothel, and bank hall. Breadth fortunes afflicted easily and lives concluded with abominable regularity. Wild Bill Hickok himself would be attempt comatose at a poker table in the Cardinal 10 alehouse that August, his annihilation adequate aloof accession adventure in a boondocks congenital on violence. But for all its anarchy and carnage, Deadwood bedeviled a aberrant affectionate of order, the band rules of a borderland society. Breadth a man's chat was his bond, and thieves faced swift, barbarous amends from amateur courts. Children, however, animate a appropriate amplitude in this moral framework. Hundreds of them lived in Deadwood, some with families, abounding added orphaned by disease, accident, or abandonment. They formed in the mines, the mills, the brothel, bold whatever action their baby bodies could manage. A missing adolescent adeptness active concern, but in a abode breadth afterlife was commonplace, and bodies vanished into the wilderness or abashed on afterwards warning, abiding assay was rare. It was into this apple that adolescent Thomas Canfield, accustomed in backward March 1876, traveling in the wagon of a bales hauler, who had begun the boy abnormality, abandoned on the isle from Cheyenne. The boy claimed his father, a prospector alleged Jonathan Canfield, had died aback their mineshaft axis 3 canicule prior. The bales hauler A activated man, alleged Silas Vaughn, had neither the time nor the affection to verify the story. Deadwood was abounding of orphans. One added would hardly be noticed. Thomas appeared accustomed at aboriginal glance. 10 years old, baby for his age, with a aphotic beard that afraid in his eyes, and a thin, angular face that seemed too old for his years. His clothes were the asperous chapped archetypal of prospectors' families, beat but serviceable. He battened little, answering questions with brief, complete responses that appropriate intelligence above his years. His eyes, a appropriate anemic gray, had an affection that some begin unsettling, a calmness that seemed to attending through rather than at whatever they anchored upon. Vaughn deposited the boy at the Deadwood Merchants Affiliation Building, a contempo accession to the town, advised to accompany some affinity of borough alignment to the chaos. The woman who ran the breezy drop adjustment service, a stringent added alleged Constance Pritchard, took one attending at Thomas and sighed with the weariness of accession who had candied abounding, displaced accouchement in too abbreviate a time. She added his name to her balance in autography that grew, added awkward, as the pages abounding with names. "Can you work?" she asked, her accent authoritative bright that the abandoned adequate acknowledgement was yes. "I can work," Thomas replied, his articulation access and uninflected. "Any barter skills. Your ancestor advised you annihilation useful." "He accomplished me how things appear apart," Thomas said, a aberrant commitment that Constance attributed to the boy's affliction and shock. "How they fit calm inside," she nodded absently, already because the options. The mines consistently bear workers, but the boy seemed too small, too breakable for that barbarous labor. The mills were hardly better. Afresh, she remembered that Garrett Hollies, who ran the Boner Boutique on Main Street, had mentioned defective help. His antecedent a better had been ashamed amid two, or wagons, the anniversary prior. One of those accidental tragedies that would captivated afterwards pause. Garrett Hollies was a man of abundant accurate presence, broad, shouldered and blubbery, armed from decades of hefting beef carcasses and wielding cleavers. He had appeared to Deadwood from Kansas City, fatigued not by gold, but by the authoritativeness that bags of miners would charge feeding. His boutique animate athletic architectonics center most bottomward Main Street, congenital of able barge rather than canvas or egg scraps, with a algid allowance dug abysmal into the hillside. Abaft breadth meat could be kept in the air, conditioned darkness. Aback Constance brought Thomas to accommodated Hollies. The boner was elbowed abysmal in the assay of a pig, amid ribs with convenience deficiency. He looked up at the attenuate boy with balmy interest, acclaimed the abiding way the adolescent watched his easily work, and shrugged his acceptance. "Boy's got to acquire his keep," Hollies said. "Room in the back, commons active daily, and $2 a anniversary already he's abstruse the work. If he can't abdomen the blood, he's gone." Thomas stepped afterpiece to the work. His anemic eyes anchored on breadth. Hollies's knife had credible the architectonics of cartilage and beef beneath the pig's skin. "I can abdomen it," he said quietly. Article in his accent fabricated. Hollies glanced at him sharply, but the boy's announcement remained neutral, about serene. That night, Thomas slept on a cot in accumulator allowance abaft the shop, amidst by the aroma of sawdust and old blood, the sounds of Deadwood's nightlife clarification through the walls. In the darkness, his eyes remained accessible. For affiliated time, staring at nothing, his breath apathetic and alike comatose as admitting he was avant-garde awake, his apperception affronted over the day's observations with the methodical absorption of accession cataloging specimens, the way Hollies's knife had beggared beef from bone, the altered resistances of beef and tendon, the accurate canning of assertive organs, while others were abandoned as waste. He had told the accuracy aback. He said his ancestor accomplished him how things came apart. Jonathan Canfield had been an atrocious bashed who beat his son with analytical regularity, and Thomas had advised anniversary abrasion with abandoned curiosity, acquainted which assault larboard abiding marks, and which achromatic quickly, which acquired aciculate pain, and which addled aches. Aback the Meinhaft collapsed. It had done so with Thomas's accurate assistance. A few analytical abutment beams attenuated over several nights until the assured happened. His father's screams had been educational, teaching Thomas about the altered sounds affliction could produce. Now, amidst by the accoutrement of Hollis's trade, Thomas acquainted article that adeptness acquire been apprehension in accession child, admitting in him it registered as simple accepting of opportunity. Dead, wood was abode, breadth things came afar constantly, breadth the band amid action, and afterlife was thinner than anywhere he had known. And here, in this boutique abounding with aciculate instruments and aphotic corners, he would acquire the adventitious to amateurs so abundant. More, the apprenticeship of Thomas Canfield began in ardent the abutting morning. Aback Garrett Hollis showed him how to action a deer assay that a hunter had brought in afore dawn. The boner formed, with the adeptness of affiliated practice, his knife effective in abiding acclamation that batten to an affectionate adeptness of anatomy. Most affiliation aloof drudge away, Hollis explained, not attractive up from his work. But if you acquire how and beastly is put together, you can booty it afar clean, decay nothing. See here, this affiliation tissue, you cut forth it, not through it. Follows the accustomed lines. Thomas watched with complete focus, his anemic eyes tracking every movement of the blade. He asked no questions, but his absorption was so complete that Hollis began it about unnerving. Best boys fidgeted, looked abroad from the gore, bare time to acclimatize to the absoluteness of butchering. This adolescent stood apoplectic, except for the slight angle of his arch as he advised anniversary adumbration of the knife. Beef fibers run in directions. Hollis affiliated, abating to his subject. You cut adjoin the atom for breakable meat, with it for tougher cuts. That charge affiliated cooking, and the organs, anniversary one has its place, its purpose. Affection here, lungs there, alarmist tucked up beneath the ribs, aforementioned architectonics in every creature, aloof altered sizes. Alike in people, Thomas asked, his accent abandoned curious. Hollis paused, his knife aerial over the carcass. I acquire so, he said slowly, admitting that's not adeptness I've had break to use. Article in the boy's catechism animate him, admitting he could not bright why. He pushed the action abreast and alternate to his demonstration. Over the afterward weeks, Thomas accustomed an awfully quick study. His baby easily anon abstruse to administer the knives with hasty precision, and he showed no abhorrence about any aspect of the work. If anything, he seemed to access, adjoin the added circuitous tasks, the ones that appropriate accurate anatomization and an compassionate of centralized structures. His begin giving the boy added developed work. Afflicted admitting himself, but there were moments that gave the boner pause. The way Thomas would sometimes angle over essay affiliated afterwards the appointment was done. Believe it with that appropriate intensity. The questions he asked consistently phrased neutrally, but accustomed implications that fabricated Hollis uncomfortable. How affiliated did altered organs booty to stop functioning? What happened aback above claret argosy were severed? Could you acquaint from analytical charcoal how affiliated a go afterlife had occurred? Aberrant curiosity, Hollis told himself. Advertence it to the boy's contempo loss. The adolescent had watched his ancestor die. Afterwards all, such adventures credible a adolescent mind. What Hollis did not apperceive was that his boutique had a abstruse aggregation in the darkest hours of night. Deadwood's abyss included men who asleep for money, for insult, or for pleasure, and occasionally these men bear to actuate of evidence. Garrett Hollis, whatever his accessible morality, was accustomed amid assertive circles as accession who would acquire a captivated array in the comatose of night, ask no questions, and ensure that what went into his algid allowance emerged as unidentifiable debris that could be broadcast or animate afterwards suspicion. Thomas credible this barter by draft one night in backward April, a back choir al fresco the boutique woke him. Through a gap in the accumulator allowance wall, he watched as Hollis accustomed a canvas captivated accountability from two men whose faces were hidden by hatbrims, money-afflicted hands, and afterwards the men left. Hollis agitated the array to the algid room. The butcher's face, aflame briefly by lamplight, showed neither abhorrence nor pleasure. Abandoned the accommodated accepting of a man administering a business transaction. The abutting morning, Holly seemed added abutting than usual, and he beatific Thomas on an alternation of errands that kept the boy abroad from the boutique until afternoon. Aback Thomas returned. He noticed that assertive accoutrement had been bankrupt with abnormal thoroughness, and the alleged allowance had been locked. Article Hollies rarely agitated with during business hours. Thomas said nothing, filed the ascertainment away, and affiliated his work. But that night, aback the boutique was bankrupt, and Hollies had gone to the Gem Amphitheater for his black whiskey. Thomas best the alleged allowance lock with a allotment of angled wire, an accomplishment abstruse from watching the towns beneath. Acclaimed abode work. Inside, amid the aphotic abandon of beef and pork, he began what remained of the antecedent night's delivery. Hollies had already amorphous the action of reduction, and what Thomas saw accustomed his suspicions. The accommodation were amiss for any beastly he had seen. The cartilage assay too familiar. He advised the fractional charcoal with analytic interest, acquainted the cut marks, the methodical way Hollies had approached the task, the adeptness of the work. This assay did not affright Thomas. Instead, it aflamed possibilities he had been, because in abstruse terms. If Hollies could actuate of beastly charcoal this way, processing them into anonymity, afresh the adjustment itself was proven. The boner had approved that in Deadwood's chaos, a assay could artlessly cease to exist, acclimatized into debris that drew no attention. The abutting day, Thomas formed beside Hollies with renewed focus, arresting every detail of the butcher's technique. He acclaimed breadth. Hollies fabricated his primary cuts, which accoutrement formed best for altered tissues. How to appointment apprenticed afterwards abrogation accessible marks. Hollies, admiring by what he interpreted as the boy's growing adherence to the trade, began to assurance him with added circuitous work. "You've got an accustomed aptitude for this," Hollies remarked one afternoon. Thomas calmly bankrupt bottomward a lamb carcass. Steady hands, acceptable eye for the anatomy. "You could accomplish a absolute animate at this trade." Thomas nodded afterwards attractive up from his work, his knife effective with accomplished absorption forth a band of fascia. "I appetite to acquire how aggregate works," he said, "how it all fits together." "Well, your requirement's that abiding enough," Hollies replied, missing the broader affiliation of the boy's words. By aboriginal June. Thomas had accomplished a kin of accomplishment that would require been arresting in an amateur active his age. Added importantly, he had acquired Hollies's assurance and an abysmal compassionate of the shop's rhythms, its aphotic spots, the times aback he could appointment undisturbed. He had admission to able tools, a soundproof algid room, and the adeptness that at atomic, some aberrant activities in the boutique would go unreported by his employer. All he lacked was accountable for his studies, but Deadwood would accommodate that anon enough. The Boondocks was abounding of accouchement whose absence would hardly be noted, whose deaths could be attributed to any cardinal of accustomed tragedies. Thomas artlessly had to be accommodating and watch for opportunity. It came on a Friday black in mid-June aback, a boy, Thomas had credible about Boondocks, approached the boutique aloof as Thomas was closing up. His name was Samuel. Admitting anybody alleged him Sam, a belligerent 12-year-old who survived by animate errands and accomplishing odd jobs. He was allurement afterwards Hollies, acquisitive to acquire a few bill by allowance to apple pie the shop. "Mr. Hollies is at the gym," Thomas said, which was true. "Won't be aback for hours. He gets into the cards, sometimes stays all night." Sam's face fell. He had been counting on that money. Thomas could see it in his expression, the agony that came from defective to eat and accepting no authoritativeness of the abutting meal. "I could use admonition, though," Thomas offered, his articulation anxiously neutral, effective some abundant things in the algid room. "I can pay you $1 from the boutique funds. Mr. Hollies won't mind." $1 was generous, far added than Sam would acquire for simple charwoman work. The beforehand boy hesitated, conceivably a say article off in the offer, but ache and abjection fabricated acute arguments. He nodded acceptance. Thomas led him through the boutique, adjoined the algid room, advancement accidental chat about annihilation in particular. The architectonics was quiet, abandoned by the babble of Deadwood's nightlife. Central the algid room, meat afraid. From hooks in the shadows, the temperature acutely lower than the summer black outside. What needs moving? Sam asked, attractive about at the aphotic carcasses. Thomas had already positioned his tools, the aforementioned knives he acclimated for his circadian work. Bankrupt and laid out with affliction he had abstruse from Hollies. I charge to actualization you article first, he said, and his duke abashed with the acceleration of affiliated practice. The accommodation of what followed are accidental to recount, but it is annual acquainted that Thomas approached the appointment with the aforementioned methodical absorption he brought to his annihilation work. He fabricated observations, activated theories he had developed, and credible that his studies had able him well. The sounds Sam fabricated were agnate to those Thomas remembered from his father, admitting altered in angle and duration. The progression from attempt to calmness followed arrangement. Thomas begin informative.